Hi everyone, welcome to the second part of Chapter 5, which focuses on the integumentary system. So in our previous part, we discussed the integumentary system is mostly composed of the skin, and in it we have the epidermis, the dermis, and of course, let's not forget to mention the hypodermis. We also discussed the different layers and the cell types that you would find. And what we'll do in the second part is we'll focus on some of what we like to call the accessory items of the integumentary system. Let's go ahead and have a talk about hair, nails, as well as some of the glands that you will find embedded within the skin. Starting off with hair, I want to remind you that when you look at your hair, you're really looking at just layers upon layers of dead keratinized cells. I don't think anybody wants to think about their hair as a dead cell, but truth of the matter is that hair is packed with a hard keratin that allows it to have the texture of the filaments that we see whenever we're looking at hair that's growing on our scalp or looking at our eyebrows or twitching our eyelashes. And what we see with the hair is that it has many different functions. One of them primarily is that it allows us for detection of items like little insects or microbes crawling on us, but also it provides us protection for heat loss as well as the sun. Hair will cover most of the body, and hair comes in different variations. We'll talk a little bit more about what we call terminal versus villus hair. But as you can see on the PowerPoint, it's highlighted that there are some areas of the body where hair is lacking, and that would be the palms, the soles, lips, nipples, and of course, some portions of our external genitalia. Hair is produced by hair follicles, and what I would love to do is take you over to the next slide and have a nice look at these particular items that we would find within a hair follicle. The first thing I want to point out is the top part is going to be a cross section of a strand of hair. And at the bottom section right here, you have more of a longitudinal view where you can see the entire bulb and the follicle. And I want to highlight this particular area right here, the hair matrix. In the hair matrix is where you're going to have the origin of the new cells that are being formed and packed together. And within the hair itself, you're going to have three different sections. Starting off in the middle, you're going to have what we like to call the medulla section. And the medulla is usually filled with larger cells, and it can also hold on to little air pockets. On either sides of the medulla, you're going to have the cortex, which will have layers of cells, and that is then followed by the cuticle, which will have overlapping cells that kind of sit on top of each other. I also want to point out that the color of your hair is courtesy of the melanocytes. You can see that they have been drawn for you right over here. And depending on the quantity and, of course, the variety of melanocytes, it will determine if your natural hair color will be black, brown, red, or blonde. And also, we can discuss the fact of what happens when your hair turns gray. Gray can be caused by a lack of production of melanin, courtesy of the melanocytes, but it's also can caused by having huge air gaps that will form in the medulla, allowing for the hair color not to be able to adhere nor be displaced on the follicle itself. Another cute factor or an interesting factor I should say about the hair is that within the hair follicle, you're going to have the erector pili muscle. And here you can see it illustrated. Now, the erector pili muscle for us is what causes goosebumps. It is what we like to call a vestigial structure, meaning that it really doesn't do anything for us. But once upon a time it did. And in order to figure out what that original role was, we don't have to look any much further than a lot of our animals that we have in our house. So if you have a dog or a cat, you might notice that whenever they get excited or they see someone that they might want to kind of like feel that they might be in harm's way or protect you from, not only are they going to start barking and meowing, but you also see that they start fluffing up their fur. And that is because the erector pili muscle will erect the follicle, allowing the hair to stand up straight, thereby allowing the organism to appear larger than they actually are. So it was actually meant as kind of like a little defense mechanism to give a warning to the enemy of stay away because I could take you on. Of course, for us, we no longer have action. Instead, the erector pili muscle simply gives us little goosebumps whenever we get excited, or some of us when we get nervous. On this particular illustration, we're once again seeing a cross-section of the hair. And in this case, what we're looking for is we're going to talk about how the shape of the cross section, or I should say, really the arrangement of it, has to do with the overall texture or appearance of the hair. When hair is straight, such as Exhibit A right here and Exhibit B, that usually means that you have a round cross section, aka a round arrangement of the medulla and the cortex and the cuticle region. As it starts to elongate into more of a oval, we see that the texture will start adjusting by becoming more wavy. And as it starts flattening out, the waves will actually turn even more curlier as it comes about. Now, as you take a look at the cross section, you might also notice that they went ahead and they labeled for you eumelin and phomelin. These are different variations of melanin, or the coloring of the hair. And depending on which one you are genotypically expressing and the combination of it, it will then determine if you have darker hair or lighter hair. So for instance, if we're looking at someone who has red hair, we usually see that they have higher quantities of phomelin, versus the eumelanin, you'll usually have large quantities of that when you look at someone who has darker hair. And here on the end, you can see that you have someone who's representing the gray hair, and it's highlighting the fact that one of the reasons why gray hair, which indicates the lack of melanin or color, is due to the fact of air spacing being created within the medulla section. Now, if you're someone who dyes their hair, what we're doing is that we're artificially adding pigments to the cuticle of the hair follicle, and these pigments can then go ahead and be put on display within the cuticle and cortex region, allowing for your new hair color, courtesy of the box or your hairstylist, to be displayed. And of course, as the hair continues to grow from the hair matrix, that hair color will then be replaced or outgrown by your genotypical expression, or I should say your phenotypical expression based on the genotype or your DNA. Now, I said to you before, there are different types of hair. We have thellus hair and we have terminal hair. Terminal hair is hair that we can physically observe and usually has a color to it. So if you think, for instance, the hair that's on our forearms, that's on our legs, probably the best example would be to take a look at the hair that's growing out of your scalp, your eyebrows and your eyelashes. It is a little bit more coarse. It tends to be longer. We call that terminal hair. And terminal hair will have different growth patterns. We usually see that at puberty, it'll start growing in areas where it wasn't before, such as in the armpit region and in the pubic region. And part of that has to do with the fact that you have a spike of different hormones that are, of course, contributing to the puberty cycle being experienced. Thellus hair, on the other hand, is more of a fine, pale hair. I always like to tell students, whenever you're looking at yourself in the mirror, you notice that on your cheeks, there's like a little bit of fuzz that grows on your face naturally. I know some people like to kind of shave it off, but that little peach fuzz that you're observing, that is an example of thellus hair. Both of the hairs obviously have different functions, but part of it is, of course, for protection and regulation of water hydration within the body itself. I do want to point out that your hair growth is affected by nutrients and hormones. And in fact, something that I point out in most of my classes whenever we talk about hair is oftentimes when patients come in and we suspect that there might be an eating disorder such as bulimia, one of the telltale signs that the physicians or the nurses will look for is that their terminal hair has fallen out and has been replaced with thellus hair. And part of that is because they're not absorbing proper nutrients, so they can't maintain the terminal hair growth. And instead, the body will switch over to the finer hair, which is the thellus hair. At the bottom of the slide, it kind of hints at the fact that each follicle cycle will have what we call an active and a regressive phase. And that obviously indicates an area where there'll be growth and an area where they'll just kind of stay dormant. And then usually what we see is that, for instance, with scalp hair, you'll have about 90 of them that you'll lose a day. And what that means is that it loosens itself from the bulb. And then, of course, the hair will regrow itself as it goes back into the active phase. A few terminologies to take a look at our clinical application for hair. Alopecia, from a scientific sense, that means that there is hair thinning that comes into play after the age of 40, and this can affect both males and females. True baldness is a genetic disorder that affects a mutation on the X chromosome, so it is sex influenced. Now, the interesting part about that is even though it's on the X chromosome and women have two X's versus one X for male, true baldness actually affects more men than it does women. And the reason for that is because the gene is activated by high levels of DHT, which is a form of testosterone. From a natural aspect, the males will genetically produce higher levels of testosterone, which allows for the expression of the baldness gene. And I should kind of add the baldness gene, what we see happening within the follicle is as the hair falls out, the opening of the follicle will actually narrow. And this means that the hair that regrows will become thinner and finer until eventually the opening of the follicle completely closes, at which time no new growth will be seen. All right, so let's take a look now at our nails. So we're still taking a look at our integumentary system, so please keep that in mind. Now for the nails, we have another example of an accessory item, and in this case, what we're looking at epidermal cells that have more of a scale-like appearance, and very similar to the hair, they're going to be packed with hard keratin. The nails are a protective layer for the end of your phalanges, your fingers and your toes. And when you look at the overall structure of the nail, we see that you have what they call a nail plate, you have a free edge, and you have a root. The bed of the nail is actually filled with epidermal cells that are underneath your nail plate. Actually, let me show you this on the illustration, and then we'll talk about the nail matrix, and we'll also talk about why your nail appears pink and all the other good stuff. Here's my beautiful illustration, and you can see that you have the body of the nail, and underneath it, you have your nail bed. So the body of the nail is just nothing but hard keratin, and then underneath it in the nail bed, you'll have your epidermal cells. And then the nail matrix is where the new growth occurs. And as the nail, of course, ejects or projects out of the body, what we see happening is that the top portion of the nail appears pink, or I should say the body of the nail appears pink, and that is because of the underlying capillaries that you have by the nail bed. And then usually many of us have this like little white crescent area. This is called the lunule. The lunule appears white because it tends to have a thicker composition, and it also is a little bit looser over there. So that is also why your capillaries do not peek through. Hence, they appear white versus the pink of the majority of the nail shield. Alrighty. So that was short and sweet. The next section is going to be for our glands. So this is the reference glands, are examples of sweat glands that you can find all over the body, with the exception of the nipples and the external genitalia. You have two variations. You have the ones that will secrete, sweat, a watery secretion, and then you have one who will have one that's more heavier on like a milky fatty acid type of secretion. We call that merocrine or eccrine sweat glands and apocrine sweat glands. Let's take a look at the difference between those two. Now, both of the secretions will be an example of an exocrine secretion because they will be excreted towards an open space, will be the outside layer of the cell. So let's start with the merocrine or eccrine sweat glands. These are the most numerous, abundant on the palms, the soles, and the forehead, and they will utilize a duct to exit through the pores, so that makes it a little exocrine secretion. Its primary function is thermoregulation, so whenever the body feels that it is in a environment where it is hot or warm, or it just wants to prevent overheating, it will go ahead and secrete sweat as a cooling mechanism. And this is really sweat in the sense of what we think about when someone is sweating. So its composition is mostly water. However, it will also have some antibiotic component to it. It will have a little bit of vitamin C, and it will always have a little bit of metabolic waste in it because that's just what you typically have in your sweat. But it is 99% water. And when we add the illustration of it, we can see that the eccrine gland is a secretory cell that is embedded within the dermis layer. And then whenever it has sweat that needs to be secreted, we can see that it has a duct that will then lead it through a pore where it will then cover the epidermis of the skin, providing its cooling mechanism. And of course, also giving us a prime example of what an exocrine secretion is going to be. And just a gentle reminder, exocrine versus endocrine. Endocrine means that the secretion has to travel into the bloodstream to find a target cell. So any of your hormones, growth hormone, testosterone, estrogen, those would be an endocrine secretion. Exocrine means that you have a duct that will lead to an opening or an external surface, and that would then, for instance, be the sweat gland in this example, or for instance, if you think about your digestive glands, see, for instance, the pancreas. All right, now those were the merocrine. So now let's take a look at the apocrine sweat glands. These are going to be found in the armpit, axillary, and genitalia region. And instead of just having a watery mixture, this one's going to have more of a milky to yellowish appearance, and that is because it is full of fatty substances and proteins. Now, the interesting fact is whether it is the water-based sweat gland or the substances and protein-based sweat glands, what we see happening is that these secretions naturally are odorless. Now, what causes us then to develop that smell that some of us get whenever we're sweating? Part of that is because the bacteria that we find all over the place, including on our clothes, whenever we excrete sweat, the bacteria will start feeding on it, and that then causes the odor to develop. So it's not you, it's the bacteria. Apocrine sweat glands, in addition to their difference in secretion with the merocrine sweat glands, another difference is that their ducts will actually empty into the hair follicles. So they will share an opening with the hair growing on the scalp or in the armpit and genitalia areas. And a lot of people will also talk about apocrine sweat glands as having to do with the production of an individual scent. Some people like to call that a pheromone. We know that in nature, there are lots of animal models where a pheromone secretion is used to attract one sex to the other, primarily during reproduction cycles. With humans, it's still up there for debate. Some scientists say that we do secrete pheromones, but we are not able to interpret them. Others say that we no longer produce pheromones because we have basically introduced things like bathing and covering our bodies with lotions and perfumes. So the debate is still there. But either way, please know that the apocrine sweat gland, that secretion is more of a milky based secretion that usually has to do with enticing. And that is why we see a spike of it in puberty, as well as its location of the axillary and the genitalia area. There are also some examples of what we call modified apocrine glands. Those are going to be, for instance, mammary glands, which come into play whenever there is a pregnancy for the secretion of milk for the newborn. And the Crumnus glands, that is what we have in our ears, and it helps us to produce the earwax, which can trap any type of pathogen or small items that try to creep inside our ear canal. It will prevent them from moving in it by wrapping it into the earwax, which then hopefully is removed whenever you clean your ears. You also have sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands produce more of an oily secretion, aka sebum. And the thought process about the sebum is that it's supposed to soften the hair and the skin. This one will also develop from the hair follicles and secrete into it. Usually we see that they will also have a spike in activity once puberty is reached. Most of this has to do with the androgen hormones that are released, your sex hormones that are released or spiked when puberty hits. I often tell people, the real a good way of seeing your sebum gland in action is by taking a look at your hair. Some of us can go a few days without washing our hair. Others will notice that it has like a oily type of greasy appearance that it starts to have as the hair gets dirty. And part of that is because it's filled with sebum. The other thing that we tend to do, if you like to apply body lotion to your skin, well, whenever you get a chance, take a look at some of the ingredients listed, and you're going to see things like lanolin, which is basically sebum from other organisms, like for instance, sheep. So it's another way that we tend to hydrate the body and soften it. If you would like to know what a whitehead versus a blackhead is, a whitehead is whenever you have a blocked sebaceous gland, and whenever this blockage is then exposed to high levels of oxygen, it will go ahead and turn into a blackhead. Acne is when you have an infection within the glands, and acne can be caused by many different things. It can be caused because we have some dirt on the skin that hasn't been properly cleaned, so it sits within the glands and it develops an inflammation or infection. Some people have also a bacterial infection that will cause acne to develop within the skin. So lots of reasons that can cause inflammation of the glands. Here is an illustration of our sebaceous gland, and I just want to kind of point out that you could see that they are very closely associated with the hair follicle, which means that their secretion will be released through there as well, compared, of course, to the eccrine gland, our little sweat glands, which are independent and are utilizing the pores. Alrighty, so as we the end part of the skin, I just want to kind of highlight some of the functions that we've discussed so far. We talked about the fact that the skin is, of course, our largest organ, and it's our primary protection from any type of external entities that are trying to make their way into our body. And part of that is, of course, the barrier that it forms. Now, within the skin itself, we see that it's able to protect due to different chemical, physical, or biological defense systems. So, for instance, one of them is that it produces it produces a very acidic environment. So we call that an acid mantle, which makes it very unlikely for bacteria and fungus to grow on top of it. Sweat has not only a hydrating mechanism, it also has a flushing or a cleansing mechanism. We talked about how melanin is secreted to protect us from the UVs from the sun. We also talked about the fact that it helps, as we're sweating, my apologies, helps with our body temperature regulation, the hairs on our skin, as well as the Merkel cells in our epidermis allow us for cutaneous sensations. We see that we have the production of a vitamin D as well as collagenase. Collagenase is an enzyme that helps us with the natural turnover of collagen, which is actually an excellent way for us to prevent wrinkles from forming. The skin can also serve as a blood reservoir. And last but not least, because of its ability to secrete, we see that it can get rid of some of the waste products we have, such as ammonia, urea, uric acid, and good old-fashioned sodium or salt. Here is just another example, or I should say another illustration of our skin. And I really like this one because it starts to put all the different aspects that we've talked about. We started our part one with talking about the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis, and what you would expect. And then towards this end of our lecture, part two, we took a look at more of the accessory or appendages of the skin and learned more about their origin and their overall function. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the clinical applications, so some of the disease models. For the skin, the book decided to focus on skin cancer and burns because these are often the most common illnesses that we encounter with the integumentary system. So let's go ahead and let's start off with skin cancer. Skin cancer can be diagnosed in many different ways. Oftentimes, the patient will come in and will notice an abnormal growth. The good news is that most of these abnormalities will be biopsied and they'll come back as benign. nothing to worry about. However, sometimes there is some malignancy, which means that we do have to go ahead and follow up with the patient to make sure that they get the proper treatment. Skin cancer has been shown to have some genetic links. However, most skin cancer will be induced due to environmental factors, such as high exposure to the sun, and also can be caused by random mutations within the body itself. The three major types of skin cancer are basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and melanoma. Basal cell carcinoma is named because it starts within the basal layer of the epidermis. And what we see happening here is that this malignant growth is a very slow growing, and usually with proper surgical extraction, meaning that the doctor goes in and they remove the abnormal growth, as well as develop clear borders. There shouldn't be a recurrence, and the patient can continue to lead a regular, healthy life. Squamous cell carcinoma is when there is a malignancy that tends to happen in the spinous basal layer of the epidermis. And this particular skin cancer, we often see that it is fully treatable when caught early. Once again, the doctor will go in and they will remove the malignant growth. And in this case, oftentimes the patient will also be receiving some radiation, and once again, the prognosis tends to be very good once it's caught and treated properly. Melanoma is the one that we have to be very careful with. Melanoma can be an aggressive growth. In this particular skin cancer is when it develops within the melanocytes. And what we see happening here is that the melanocytes will develop an abnormal pattern of growth. So oftentimes, whenever you're talking about melanoma, you'll refer to what they call the ABCD rule. And that basically means that you have a patient that comes in, and for instance, they might have a mold or an abnormal growth that will appear where it normally wasn't, or if they had a mold, it'll be growing larger in size. So what the dermatologist will do is that they'll check for things like A for the area or the asymmetry, meaning that both sides of the mold have to have a similar appearance. If it's asymmetry, that means that one side looks different from the other. B is for border. You would like the border of the mold or the growth to be nice and smooth. So this is my attempt in trying to create a little circle. You don't want to have any indentations or abnormal growth patterns. So you don't want to have it like, for instance, in our inserted picture where the shape is very asymmetrical and has an irregular border. C is for color. You would like it to have one unison color. Whenever you have patches of browns and blacks, then you start to be a little bit worried and you want to investigate a little bit more. And D is for diameter. We tend not to want to see anything that's larger than 6 millimeters. So that's kind of like the head of the eraser that sits on top of a pencil. You don't want to have any mold or growth that's a little bit larger than that. So the ABCD rules are usually what's followed, and if they see that there's any irregularities, then the patient will obviously be recommended for removal. And then, of course, chemo or radiation might be recommended depending on the prognosis. This one, the reason that I said to you that we have to be a little careful with is because melanoma cancer can easily metastasize, which means that it spreads beyond its original um, origin. The other entity when we talk about skins that we should talk about in clinical applications are burns. So the issue with burns is, of course, that anytime your skin burns off, you lose that protective layer, which makes you more prone for infection from any type of bacteria or fungal type of exposure. But beyond that, it also means that you lose massive amounts of water. So the immediate threat of burns is actually the fear of dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. So scientists have developed this thing called the rule of nine. And what it does is it basically breaks the body down into 11 different sections. And feel free to take a look at the illustration on the right hand side to see. Like, for instance, the anterior and posterior head and neck makes up 9%. the anterior and posterior of the upper limb, so that means the front and the back of the arms. That makes up of the arms and the legs. Of the arms, hiya, the anterior and the posterior of both arms make up 18%. And then, of course, we're also going to do that with the lower limbs, anterior, posterior of the lower limbs. That's going to make up 36%. And then the anterior and posterior of the trunk is 36%. Hi, I feel like I butchered those numbers. My sincere apology for that. In fact, let me erase my little markings so you could take a look at it. But basically, what the rule of 9 does is it takes a look at different areas of the body and it divides it then into sections that represent 9% of the body surface. The reason this comes about is because when a patient comes in that has suffered burns, you don't want to waste time calculating the height and the weight of a patient and then putting into factor what percentage of what part of the body is burned. Instead, if the patient comes in, for instance, and they have burns to the front, the anterior and back posterior of the right arm, you automatically would be able to reference this chart and come up with the fact that it's 4.5% for the front, 4.5% in the back. So that means that there's 9% of the body surface that is damaged. So the rules, and on the side right here, you can kind of see the breakdown that I butchered before with my percentages, my apologies. You can then reference really quickly as to how many fluids need to be replaced within the patient. So the rule of 9s just give us a really quick way to estimate the volume of fluid loss. Our last slide, I want to show you the difference between first, second, and third degree burn. So basically think of your layers of skin, and that's how we're going to go. So a first degree burn is when you have damage to the top layer or the epidermis only. Usually what we see is that the patient will have redness or swelling. This is for many of us when we go, for instance, to the beach, or we spend the day outdoors when we normally don't. And at night, we feel kind of like we have rosiness and a little bit of pain on our shoulders or any exposed area of the skin. We say, oh, we have a sunburn. Well, it's a first degree burn. Second degree burn is usually when you have blisters. And the reason for that is because it involves the epidermis and the dermis layer. And what we see happening is that water will start to accumulate between the epidermis and the dermis, allowing for the blister to form. And as you can see here on our patients, this one is a little bit more painful because it involves more damage to the skin. And then a third degree burn is when you have basically the entire skin thickness involved. So that means that you have the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis that is damaged. Initially, what we see happening is that the patient doesn't feel any pain because the third degree burn will also destroy the nerve endings. That also means that there's no area for water to accumulate, so no edema will come into play. However, third degree burns require a lot more effort for the patient to initiate healing, and part of that will often entail that skin grafting might be required. Skin grafting means that you have cells that are either laboratory grown or come from a donor or are grafted from another part of the patient's body, where the cells are then removed and then covered over the area that is burned. This allows the epithelium cells to start regenerating. Without the skin grafting and the epithelium cells being able to connect to each other, we often see that there will be some necrotic growth that will not only hinder repair, but it will also be very painful for the patient as it often has to be removed in order to have healthy tissue that starts to grow. So first degree is the epidermis, second degree is the epidermis and the dermis, and then the third degree means that you have the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis that have been affected. Alrighty, I think I will stop there. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to contact me. I hope you have a wonderful remainder of the day, and we shall talk soon in our next chapter. Bye, everyone.